Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and more specifically we'll be looking at aggregate demand. So our goal for today is to first be able to learn how to draw and label the graph correctly, and then begin to look more into aggregate demand and understand why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and be able to identify times in which the aggregate demand curve will shift. So we begin with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. The vertical axis of the graph is measuring aggregate price level. It's going back to our conversation about CPI or the GDP deflator as a measure of aggregate prices, recognizing there are lots and lots of products. Some prices are going up, some are going down, but what's the general trend? And so that's sort of what the vertical axis is going to be measuring. It's not individual prices of goods, but the price level that the economy is at. The horizontal axis is real GDP. So it's measuring the value of all goods and services in the economy, all new goods and services in the economy being produced in a given year. And then we have the aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping, and we'll talk about that today. Then we have what's known as the short-run aggregate supply curve, which we'll talk about in another video. Where those two curves intersect is where we find equilibrium, at least in the short run. And so we've got our price level on the vertical axis and real output on the horizontal axis, and real output is labeled with the letter Y. Together they make equilibrium. And that equilibrium point will change depending on changes in the economy, causing a shift in either the aggregate demand curve or the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, aggregate demand is a downward sloping curve, just like demand in microeconomics is downward sloping. What it's measuring is all of the possible combinations of aggregate demand and price level. It's looking at all of the conceivable combinations of price level and total amount of goods and services demanded in the economy. So if the price level were to drop, then we would see a change in the total amount of real GDP. And the relationship is inverse. So when the price drops, we see an increase in the quantity demanded of goods and services, which is what's driving this sort of downward sloping curve. Now, why does it act that way? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, because lower price levels sort of make you wealthier. You can afford to buy more stuff with the same amount of resources when the price levels are dropping. So you will see an increase in the quantity demanded, because you will have to recall the beginning of basic economics. We know that the problem of scarcity is what's driving everything in econ, that we have unlimited wants but limited resources. And so when our limited resources seemingly expand, it expands our ability to consume goods and services. Another reason it's downward sloping is because the lower price level sort of makes all goods more affordable in our economy, particularly things made in our economy. And so we'll purchase more things. Again, if you have more resources, you tend to purchase more goods. The specific point on the aggregate demand curve that the economy is at any one time is determined really by the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And that point can move along the aggregate demand curve if the aggregate supply curve is shifting for some reason. And so anytime there's a change in the aggregate price level, the effect of that on the aggregate demand curve is to see an equilibrium point moving along the existing curve. The curve itself doesn't change. We see a shift in aggregate demand when there is a change in the basic presumptions of the economy that go into determining how much real GDP we want at each of the various price levels. So what's causing a shift in demand? Any one of a number of things. It could be a change in our expectations about the future. It could be a change in our overall wealth. It could be a change in the existing stock of capital goods, or it could be government policy, both fiscal and monetary, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Any of these changes are changing fundamentally the total amount of real GDP that is going to be demanded in the economy, regardless of what the price levels will be. And that's the indication that the aggregate demand curve itself is shifting either to the right or the left, depending on whether we want more stuff or less stuff. So when we talk about expectations, we're talking about what do we think will happen in the future. So stop and think for a second, pause the video in a moment and to sort of take a guess, and then think about why you came up with that answer, and then press play and see if you're right. If we expect the economy to grow in the future, what will happen to aggregate demand? Given an expectation of a strong economy and growing economy, then we would expect that there would be more resources available to people to be able to buy more stuff. We'd see an increase in consumer spending. We might see an increase in investment spending by businesses as they look to ramp up production to produce more goods for what they expect they're going to need to sell. All of this is going to create an increase in the goods and services demanded in the economy and cause a shift to the right in aggregate demand, which is why one of the most important numbers that economists can follow to sort of guess at what's going to happen to the economy in the near future is to look at what they call the Consumer Confidence Index. If people are confident about the future, they tend to act more confidently and they tend to purchase more things. If they become a little bit more nervous about the future of the economy, they begin to withdraw their consumption, and we begin to see aggregate demand shrink, right? So when we look at the data, we can see that if you follow the Consumer Confidence Index, it tends to rise during positive economic times. And then if you see those colored bars, those are periods of recession. And during periods of recession, aggregate demand shrinks. And we also see that during periods of recession, consumer confidence also tanks. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we can convince consumers that things will be rosy all the way into the future, they'll continue to act that way and maintain a momentum in the economy. If they start to get skittish, you begin to see the economy shrink. What about wealth? Again, the question is, how would aggregate demand change if the stock market were to crash, as an example? So think about that for a moment, pause the video, see if you can determine what you think will happen, and then we'll talk about it. If the stock market were to crash, then presumably people's wealth would diminish. They would be worth less because their stocks, bonds, mutual funds would be worth less. And we know that when people have less wealth or feel less wealthy, they tend to reduce their purchases of goods and services. They tend to withdraw their consumption. And when people no longer want as many goods and services as before, then we begin to see aggregate demand shift. And in this case, it shifts to the left. When stock markets are rising, then presumably you would see an increase in wealth, and people generally respond in a positive way and begin to spend more stuff. So if the stocks were in reverse, instead of crashing, they were booming, we'd generally expect to see aggregate demand shift to the right. What about physical capital? How would aggregate demand change if production was reaching capacity? If production was getting closer and closer to the maximum amount that's able to be produced with the current set of capital goods that we have. So think about that, pause the video, and then see if you're right. If we're getting up to at or near capacity, we would then expect businesses would have to increase the capacity. They'd have to purchase more capital goods and services in order to produce the goods that people are demanding. And so if we see an increase in investment, then we would expect then that the total number of goods and services that people and businesses want in our economy will be increasing. So we should see a shift to the right in aggregate demand. Fiscal policy is the government's specific policies related to taxing and spending. So, and we'll talk about more about fiscal policy later in the course, but just sort of to start thinking about it now, what would happen to aggregate demand if, for example, the government decided to increase its purchases of ventilators and personal protective equipment, or PPE, face masks and face shields and gloves and that kind of stuff to deal with some sort of epidemic or pandemic outbreak of a disease, let's say. So think about that. Again, pause the video and see if you are right. If the government was going to increase its purchase of PPE and ventilators, or something else for that matter, if the government's buying more stuff than before, then we would expect that the amount of goods and services demanded in the economy would increase, because government is one of the key demanders of goods and services within the economy. So if they're buying more stuff, we would everything else being equal, we would see aggregate demand shifting to the right. And if for some reason the government were to cut spending, as if that's ever happened, but let's pretend it does, then it would cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. Taxes are another important aspect of fiscal policy. Once again, sort of think through this question and see if you're right. What would happen to aggregate demand if, for example, the government chose to increase taxes, either on businesses or individuals? It doesn't really matter, but we can pretend that it's increasing taxes on both, just for sake of argument. If the government were to increase taxes, presumably that increase in taxes would remove from the hands of individuals and businesses the resources to be able to purchase goods and services. And so as a result, we should see a decrease in both consumption and investment spending, which would cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. Now, also keep in mind this, and we'll talk more about this when we get to tax policy. Don't assume that just because the government is collecting more in taxes that the government is spending more money. The ability to spend money by especially the national government is not related at all to the amount of taxes that they collect. You can actually increase taxes and increase spending, or increase taxes and decrease spending, just as easily as you can cut taxes and increase spending. So those two levers don't work together. Okay, so here we're assuming that everything else is being equal, that spending by the government is the same. All they're doing is raising taxes. And if that's the case, then you would see a left shift in aggregate demand. The last component here is monetary policy, and that has to do with how much money is available in the economy. That policy is driven by the Federal Reserve, which again we'll talk about a little later in Unit 3 and 4. But for now, monetary policy is basically about how much money is in the system, in the banking system, and that impacts interest rates. The more money you put into the banking system, the lower interest rates will be. So again, let's think, what would happen to aggregate demand if, for example, the Federal Reserve decided to increase the money supply, pour money into the economy, and drop interest rates? What presumably would happen? That's the question. Go ahead and pause and see if you are right. If we're cutting interest rates, that should make borrowing less expensive. If borrowing is less expensive, both consumers and businesses will be happy to borrow more money in order to spend, particularly businesses, because you'll see that the expected rate of return for the business is maybe the same, but the cost of borrowing drops, which makes more projects beneficial and profitable. So they'll want to borrow more money in order to pursue opportunities. And so that's going to see more I, and that's going to cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. You'll get more opportunity to practice in class. We'll talk more about it when I see you. Until then, have a great day.